very much this morning. So I think by now everybody recognizes that the first Sunday of every month is one where we celebrate the high and holy privilege of sharing in Eucharist together. Maybe you don't refer to it as Eucharist. Maybe you refer to it as communion. Either way, we have at least a day in the life of the church where we celebrate the gospel of the eyes, as Augustine called it. The greatest Western theologian there was, I guess he's dead, or he's at home with Jesus. But we celebrate what's called the gospel of the eyes. It's where everything that we read about and all our hope that we experience in the gospel, the life, death, and resurrection, the reality of restored relationship with God, we celebrate all that in this very hands-on way of sharing the gospel. For there's no way you can forget what Jesus did when another woman or man looks you in the face and puts a bit of the bread of life in your hands and says, "This is my body given for you." You say, how could Jesus do something for me? It's in your hands. And Jesus just had this great way of reminding us, don't overcomplicate things. I'm right there in your hands. And then when you hold the cup and you recognize that the man shed every ounce of blood for when the world threw all of its grittiness, its nastiness, its brokenness, its gossip, its deceit, its everything, when the world threw all of that at Jesus, including the kitchen sink, as the saying goes, and he shed every ounce of blood to make right all those things so that none of that would have to separate us from the great love of God. Jesus just had this way of reminding us that, hey, when you have this cup, you know the story. They nailed me to the cross for all that stuff, and I shed every ounce of blood so that you would never, ever, ever not know how great my love is for you, yes, even you. And there's just some real way that when somebody holds the cup in front of you and they ask you to take that bit of the bread of life and dip it into the cup, and you say, "This is my blood shed for the remission of sin." There's just some Jesus just has this way of reminding us that it's not some grand global story that somebody like me gets paid to gin up and help you feel enthusiastic about. It's a real street level thing, because in your hands today, the very presence of the one who loves you, serves you, saves you, heals you, frees you, inspires you, and teaches you all things, what it's like to be everything God created you to. That very presence will be in your space today, if you'll let him. And with that intro, you'd think we should just move to communion, but I got some time I've got to use. This is the only job in America, right, where you get 45 minutes to use, and people get upset if you take 50. You know, so it's all cool, right? And we got a little bit of time together this morning. And as I said earlier about the new decade, that really jumped on me. And so one of the things that I wanted to just for us to start off parsing 10 new years together with this morning is kind of a reminder what all of us are going to struggle with. If you haven't already, then you hadn't been out of the house in the last 5 days. But you probably will tomorrow as you go back to your regular scheduled work programming, right? And our story as Christians begins and ends really in the same way. If you're familiar with the story in the Bible that ends in the final pages talking about Jesus, our priest, prophet, king, our Savior, coming back to earth, riding in on white horses in this white robe and this fantastic deal, and he comes to leash up the great dragon that is known as Satan. And he leads the great dragon along just like you lead your dog on the leash leads the great dragon along and throws him into the eternal fire, and all things begin to be restored and be made completely new, right? And we cheer and go, "Yay, God!" Because he has made all things brand new, and there's no thing anywhere anymore in the end of our story that separates us from being in the presence of God in a renewed heaven and earth. Our story begins, though, when that dragon was a baby. You know the story in Genesis, right? Genesis' story is the dragon hasn't gone to its full-on, like, Harry Potter dragon or whatever, you people who watch that thing or read those books. You know, the great big giant dragon. Early in our story, the dragon's just a baby, and he's in the tree. And so our creation story begins and ends. Friends, when you say yes to Jesus, your story begins and ends in the same way, and it's got this crazy dragon in the middle of it. And so today we're going to start off with our new decade talking about how our story is still really the same story, but in the hands of Jesus, that story doesn't have to end the way that it does for most. For if you're familiar with the Bible story, you know that in the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, we explain how God kind of created everything, right? 6-day creation. If you want to get into that, that's another story on a different day. God takes a break, and then we get into a second half of the story in Genesis chapter 2, where we recognize that God creates mankind, and they call him in the Hebrew they call him Adamah, which when you say that in English is Adam, right? And so God creates Adamah, and Adamah is there, and God starts to create all the animals, right? And you laugh when I tell you about the giraffe part, because I don't understand the giraffe at all. But then he parades all the animals by, and Adam names the animals, right? And then he starts to look around, and like most of us in life, you look around sometimes, and without an equal, without a counterpart, life gets lonely. And so I don't know exactly how the conversation went, but God looks at Adam, and Adam looks at God, and he goes, "Hey, man, like that dog's just not getting it in terms of companionship. I'm not really into the dragon, by the way." And so God says, "Cool, let me make you a suitable helper." So God turns on ESPN. Adam falls asleep, and he takes a rib, as you know the story. If your Bible doesn't say anything about ESPN, friends, don't worry. I made that part up. It's storytelling, right? And so Adam goes to sleep, and there's only one other time in the Bible when God puts Adam to sleep. Does it say that same word? And it's later in Genesis. Abraham has a dream that way. He uses the same word, but he goes into this deep sleep, deep REM sleep, right? And he comes back, and he has a suitable helper. And God gives the suitable helper instructions, and he gives Adam instructions. And this is where we get into the story, friends, because even from that point on, from where we're about to get in the story, now we're into chapter 3 of Genesis, early part of our story. But from that point on, we all basically have two ways that you can kill your future in the blink of an eye. And Adam and Eve kind of demonstrate for us the ways that another decade of life can be wrecked for any person. In fact, maybe even some of your 8 to 15 are wrecking their life right now, and today's a good day for you to hear a little bit about this so you can dialogue and rap with them in a new year about, or several new years, about what it means to not live in these two ways that we're prone to and get into this third way that we call the way of life. But back into the Genesis story, right, is God commands, there's one place, it's off limits. Eve decides, which, by the way, her name is, in Hebrew, is not Eve, but we just get that in English translation. She gets instruction from Adam to stay away from the one tree, right? Like kind of the George Washington and the cherry tree. Stay away from this tree. Don't eat it. Don't do anything. She gets that instruction from Adam. And you know how the story goes if you've been around the church for a while. Right? Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. If you don't, here's how it goes. Then, one day, she gets off by herself. Then, The woman saw that the tree that God had forbidden produced fruit that was good for food. It was attractive to the eyes. It was desirable for making one wise. She took some of its fruit and ate it. And she also gave some of it to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. Now, if you'll allow me to use that, I'm going to say that beginning at that particular point, friends, we got one of the ways that you can wreck your future in an instant. Right? In a new decade, we just want to kind of underscore and highlight one of the ways that the future can be wrecked right there from Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. One of the ways that you can wreck your future in no time flat is what we'll call the way of the fruit. Right? Here, let me illustrate, and it says right there in the text what we're talking about in the way of the fruit. The way of the fruit is really still has implications today. The way of the fruit is the sensual way of life. Here's what I mean by senses. Look again at what she's talking about, and this really has implications because tomorrow you're going to see all kinds of things or hear all kinds of things that you're going to be tested to see whether this is still true or not. Whether this way of the fruit still applies to you too. And so we're going to talk about it just a little bit here this morning because it still has its implications too. And it's a way to surely wreck your and my future in an instant. It's falling victim to sights, the shiny new things in life, right? I mean, she looked at the tree. It was good for, it looked like it was good for, can you imagine how polished the apple was? I mean, I don't know about you. I'm not really an apple fan. I'm a fan of apple pie, but, you know, that's like further processing. I mean, just the regular apple kind of thing. I'm like, whatever. But can you imagine, like, or maybe apples aren't your thing. Is there something in life that you can kind of look and see if maybe the way of the fruit still has some application, still has some power, still has some effectiveness in your life today? Is there some low-hanging or maybe high-hanging thing that really catches your attention? Maybe every time you drive past the Toyota lot down here. Or the Nissan lot. We don't want to leave Craig out. Or any, maybe it's I don't know what it is. Maybe it's not the eyes kind of thing for you. Let's look at some of the other ones real quick. Maybe it's the touch. Maybe it's this one. This one over the holidays caught me. Both taste and smell, otherwise known as food. I just can't say no. And now I'm going to pay for it when I have to start exercising again. Like anybody else, have you ever noticed that maybe just maybe the way of the fruit is a little more real in our day-to-day life than what we think? And my question would be, in the beginning of a new year, is the way of the fruit one of the ways that is going to derail your and my future going forward? Because we've proven over and over again, at least from our DNA, our ancestry, and some of you probably got one of those Ancestry DNA kits for Christmas. It's not going to tell you that Eve's in the family tree, but she's in there, and you're going to prove that she's in there because you're going to go somewhere throughout the course of this year, probably throughout the course of the next 13 minutes, and be tempted by the way of the fruit in some way. And the way of the fruit is a sure way, friends. It's wired in us, in our nature. The way of the fruit is a sure way for you and I to kill our future. And here's the final one of the sometimes it's not anything more than a feel. This makes me feel good. Now we won't have pastoral confession this morning because it's first of the new year. But there's lots of things that make us feel good that probably shouldn't make us feel so good. Don't you think? just wonder, is God doing something for you just to highlight just a little bit that maybe your next 10 years can be derailed in just an instant, because inside of each of us, we're carriers, and one of the ways we're carriers of derailing our own future is by this way of the fruit, if you'll allow me. It's in our DNA. And here's what it does for us, right? The way of the fruit forces us to one thing, and I'll move on from this. The way of the fruit, friends, forces us to be childish consumers. The way of the fruit, if that's the way that derails our life, it forces us to, it forces us like maybe some of your grandchildren, and it's cute because it's your grandkids, but your kids hate it, by the way. When they look at it and go, mine. Like you're trying to teach the virtue of sharing, and it just ain't going well because there's just this thing in us that just wells up at mine, right? And that's indicative of the way of the fruit, because it's kind of the consumer mentality. It's kind of the way that seeks cheap thrills and chokes off life. It's the way that always. And friends, I'm sorry to say, it's the way that always seeks a new experience in life. Sometimes it's like this. We live in a culture as well in the way of that promotes the way of the fruit, right? I love all of you who have degrees, but if you have a marketing degree, like that's what marketing is. Marketing is it's the culture's way of the fruit. We're marketed, everything's marketed to us. Heck, I market things to you. You market things to me. Everything in our sphere of influence and contact, somebody is trying to convince, persuade, or shift, help us determine the way we think, act, or move. And it's part and parcel bound in this way of the fruit. And I said it just a little bit, but the way of the fruit, and this is kind of how you can know if you and I fall into it, the way of the fruit has this kind of I deserve mentality. Now, I will confess to you on this one, because I see some of you going, good Lord, this is how you want to start the first of the year? No, I just don't want you to derail another year and not know why. I don't want you to stand at the end of another year next December and go, why has 2020 been an absolute repeat of 2019, 2018? Come to think of it, 2015, 13, 09. I don't want you to stand at another end of another year and go, why is this year a repeat of the next? Because after today, you cannot say that you did not know that there was a way that is inherent in all of us, including me, that leads you to a path that will kill your future every year flat. That's why we start this way. Because the way of the fruit is wired in us. We're wired towards sensual, tactile, touch, feel, smell kind of temptations that if we're not careful, friends, will derail our future and will cause us to miss God's best for us in our life. It's just true. And that's just one way that Eve gave us. Thank you, Eve. We love you very much, honey. But he fell victim too, right? Yeah. Thanks, Adam. We love you very much too, friend. But here's the other half of the story, right? And here's the other way I said there's two ways that can kill the future pretty quick, the way of the fruit. And let's look at verse 7 in Genesis chapter 3. It says, Then after they had eaten, their eyes were both opened, and they knew that they were naked. Which is an odd thing when they tell you to imagine everybody else naked when you're public speaking, isn't it? Like I just don't understand that at all. But that's a sidebar. And so they sewed fig leaves together and to make coverings for themselves. And here's the second way, friends, that you and I can derail our future. We can miss God's best for our life right here in Scripture, and we're going to call it the way of the fig leaf. You see what they did? You see what they did is as soon as they recognized, you ever, men, you will never own to this. You ever feigned like you knew you were where you were going while you were driving the car, but in secret you didn't know where you were going? Mm-hmm. You sure did before GPS was around. Right? And this is like, that's kind of a fantastic illustration, and I'm sorry, men, it gets to pick on us this time, but it's sort of a fantastic illustration for really what happened to our original parents. So the beginning of our family tree got duped by the baby dragon into thinking that they didn't have to listen to God. And from that, when they recognized, I stepped across the line here, what did they do? They chose the way of the fig leaf. They tried to cover it up. If you read the rest of the story, you remember when God's pacing through the garden in the cool of the day, and he starts to call for them. He says, Adam, Eve, where are you? What's going on? Hey, it's God. I'm back. Let's talk. Let's see how the day went. Tell me about the badger. Tell me about Adam, shut up about the giraffe again. But tell me about, like, what have you experienced today? And he can't find them. If you know the story, you know why he can't find them, because they've took the way of the fig leaf. They've hid themselves in the bushes. And now you don't have to be honest with me. I'll be honest with you. There's all kinds of stuff in my life that I recognize that I live in the way of the fig leaf. And I secretly wonder, and it's not so secret now because it's out loud out of my mouth, but I secretly wonder sometimes if Adam and Eve felt the same way I felt, like they could shoulder the weight of all the responsibility that was coming with going against what God said, and then once they got that weight on them, they discovered that it will crush you every time. I don't know about you, friends. I would like to, but I don't know about every corner of everybody's life. But here's what I know, is that there's corners of my life that I thought I could manhandle, man up to everything that I was signing up for, only to discover that when I recognized what I had done and what I had signed up for, it was more than I could bear. And here's what it's done for me, and this is what happens when you and I inadvertently choose the way of the fig leaf. Here's what happens. If you become a childish consumer with the way of the fruit, you'll become a coward or a critic in the way of the fig leaf. I have done it 1,012 times. Here's what it looks like. And I don't know if it looks like this way for you or not, but it forces me to choose to cover up as opposed to confess. Every single time. It forces me to choose any other route rather than be confident in the behavior that God outlines for me. And we in the religious world, I'm not picking on us. I'm just owning my share of the territory here. We in the religious world, we will choose the way of the fig leaf because we choose religion and good behavior to hide behind a lot of things. We'll try to cover ourselves up too with good behavior and try to perform and earn our way into God's presence, because here's what it sounds like. I've never in my life gone with girls that smoke or drink or chew or anybody else. Boy, that was supposed to be funny and you just completely missed it, because how many girls do you know that chew tobacco? And I guess for a sudden a minute I'm realizing that maybe you knew more than I knew were out there. You needed a break, because this is heavy stuff, man. It's like you recognize that you could wreck your whole future, and it's inherent in us to do that. Oh, it's right there. And so here's what happens when we live in the way of the fig leaf, that it forces us to basically an either-or type of situation. Sometimes we'll pick the cowardly side that says that we lack courage and confidence to really own anything. I have times like that too. I think I want the responsibility until it comes with it. And then I'll be happy to give it back to you. Parenting. Anybody ever had that realization driving in the car one day? I know you won't say yes out loud, but I know you have. You went, oh no. What am I supposed to do? Yes. But here's what happens sometimes for all of us, man, me included here. And I'm not doing it just to be a foil. I'm owning my own space on the Christian religious map here, right? Is that sometimes I take the way of the fig leaf and the coward wells up in me, and it's characterized by fear, by angerness, by bitterness, by entitlement, resentment, a whole host of things. And oftentimes the view that I take when I'm in the kind of the coward spot is one of two things. That the world would be better off is just a little bit like me. Or, I really don't deserve to even be here. I take the worse than route. You ever get that one? Feel overwhelmed, feel like you don't belong? That's indicative of covering things over. But on the converse of this is the critic side, right? And when I take the critic side of things in the way of the fig leaf, sometimes I just lack the imagination to create anything at all. Me. And it's characterized by my own pride. It's characterized, again, like I said a minute ago, by the kind of the morality of my life. I don't do that. I stay away from this. I don't talk like that. I don't go here. I don't do this. That's the way it derails my life. And it sort of implies that there's a performance effect to God's grace. That if I'll just do more and try harder, then more God's grace will come to me, friends. And that's quite possibly the worst lie that the dragon could ever get you to buy into. If you'll just do more and try harder, if you can just press the reset button and start all over again, that is the greatest trick the dragon ever convinced you of. Because you'll just get convinced that you've got to earn your way into the good graces of God time and again. And so at the end of the day, man, you say, well, this was quite possibly the least inspiring thing in the history of history. Maybe. But there is a third way. In fact, if you and I have inherent in us the way of the fruit, or the way of the fig leaf, there's a third way. The third way is the way that leads to life. In fact, all throughout the New Testament, particularly in the Gospel of John, John was infatuated with this word they call Zoe in Greek. It's life. In fact, he starts his gospel out this way in talking about it. And his whole way is a corrective to the way of the fruit and the way of the fig leaf, right? He recognizes, even in him, that the way of the fruit and the way of the fig leaf existed, and that this Jesus character is the only way to get us from those two ways that'll kill our future every time, to get us to a way that leads to life eternal. And so he even starts off his gospel this way. It says, in him there was life, Zoe. And that life was the light of all mankind. There's a third way, John says. In fact, Jesus says it like this later in John's gospel. He says, just for the Father raises the dead and gives them Zoe, gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whomever he wishes. The Spirit, he says later in John chapter 6, is the one who gives life. Human nature is of no help. You know why it's of no help? Because it's consistent with the way of the fruit and the way of the fig leaf. The way of the Spirit leads to life, Jesus says. And the words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. Thanks be unto God. If the first Adam, according to Paul, if the first Adam from 1 Corinthians, it is written, the first Adam became a living person who, by the way, fell victim to the way of the fruit and the way of the fig leaf by listening to the baby dragon. The second Adam, he says, is a life-giving spirit. Friends, if the way of the fruit and the way of the fig leaf is what drains life from us, then the corrective is the way that leads to life. And that way that leads to life is this life-giving spirit that is and known and comes through us this morning, through the elements to us. And this life-giving spirit of Jesus Christ. Jesus says, and you know the way where I'm going. If you've been around the church, you know the way. Away from the way of the fruit and the way of the fig leaf. You know the way. But Jesus says it just 2 verses further than there. In John chapter 14, verse 6. You know the way that leads to life, friends. What does he say? I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. Nobody comes to God except by me. Nobody comes to God except by me. The way of the fruit will not get us there. The way of the fig leaf will not get us there. The way that leads to life is through the one who gave his life so that you and I could find ours. The way that leads to life. In fact, the first time when God forbid them to eat, do not eat, for when you do, you will surely die. This time, the way that leads to life says, come unto me, all of you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For this is my body, if you'll allow me to have a compendium of texts here. This is my body broken for you. This is my soul poured out for you. Here I am. I am the way to life. If you will come and get it. This time, friends, the God of all creation did not forbid you to eat. This time, friends, the God of all creation forbids you to come and eat the bread of life. This time, he bids you to come. This time, he bids you not worry about papering over and being good enough, being fast enough, being smart enough. This time, he bids you to come with all your sensual desires and temptations. This time, he bids you to come with everything that you secretly wish no one would ever know about you and you think that you've hidden from God anyway. This time he bids you to come with all those things. He bids you to come. Take the elements. Be restored. Be transformed. Be renewed by the way that leads to life.